So every year, actually a few times a year, my kids ask me the same question, which is, what's the story with the minor fasts? So for example, this month we're going to be commemorating the fast day of Asara B'Tevet, the 10th of Tevet. And so you might ask, what makes this a minor fast? What's that about? If it's only minor, do we have to keep it? Basically, that's our topic for tonight. We're going to think a little bit about how we might relate to the minor fasts. So let's start with some of the basics. So Asara B'Tevet, the 10th of Tevet. Why do we fast on that day? So actually, we learned from the book of Yechezkel in the 24th chapter that this was the date when the Babylonians began their siege of Jerusalem. And because it's a minor fast, as we know, we fast only during the day from dawn until nightfall, unlike Tisha B'Av, which is a major fast, and we start the night before. And the laws of the day of a minor fast are less strict in certain ways than those of Tisha B'Av. We'll talk a little bit about the detail of that more later. So, why are these fasts different one from the other? Why are there major fasts and minor fasts? So, to answer that, we have to go back to the beginning, to the source of these fasts in the first place. The earliest source that we have that talks about these fasts of the Jewish calendar, kind of a cycle of fasts, is from the book of Zechariah. The prophet Zechariah tells us in the 8th chapter that, that the Jewish calendar has this cycle, 4 fasts that collectively commemorate, you could say, a phased process by which Bayit Rishon, the first temple, was destroyed and through which the Babylonian exile began. And so here's how Zechariah puts it. He says, Ko amar Hashem tzvaot, tzom ha'revi'i, v'tzom ha'chamishi, v'tzom ha'shevi'i, v'tzom ha'asiri, yeh levet Yehuda l'sason, u'lesimcha, u'lemoadim tovim, v'ha'emet v'ha'shalom ehavu. He says that someday, the fast of the 4th month, tzom ha'revi'i, and the fast of the 5th month, tzom ha'chamishi, and the fast of the 7th month, and the fast of the 10th month, these 4 fasts someday will become days of sason v'simcha. Okay, they'll be happy days, days of joy and gladness. So we learn a few things from this line from Zechariah. The first is that there is this cycle of 4 fasts that are connected, and they're connected to the same kind of sad story of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. That's why it's amazing that they will one day become days of joy. And so the 4 are the 10th of Tevet, right, the fast of the 10th month, so Asara B'Tevet, when the Babylonians started the siege, that's kind of the beginning. Then we have the 17th of Tammuz, that's the fast of the 4th month. That's when not only was the siege ongoing, but the walls were breached. And then Tisha B'Av is the fast of the 5th month. That's the next one. That's when the Beit HaMikdash itself is destroyed. And finally, the fast of the 7th month is Tzom Gedalia in the month of Tishrei, and that's when kind of the last remnant of Jewish self-rule under Jewish governorship of Gedalia, Nachikam, that comes to an end, and that kind of like really is the end of the story of Bayit Rishon. So, okay, so that's the first thing we learn is that we have the cycle of 4 related fast days, and then of course the end that Zechariah says that someday these fast days will be transformed into days of joy and gladness. Now, why does Zechariah talk about these fasts at all? What's the context? It's interesting. So the whole topic of Zechariah talking about these fast days comes up because in the 7th chapter, a little earlier in the book of Zechariah, we're told that a delegation comes to the prophet and they ask him a question. Here's their question. They say, all these years during the Babylonian exile, when we were living over there, we wept on Tisha B'Av and we commemorated it as a fast day. But now that we've returned to Eretz Yisrael, now that we've just begun rebuilding the new Beit HaMikdash, which they hadn't yet actually managed to build, but they were just starting, okay? But now that we're kind of on the way back, we're back on the way up again, should we continue to mourn the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash? Right? Pretty good question. As we're working on building the second Beit HaMikdash, do we have to keep mourning the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash? That's their question. And Zechariah gives an interesting answer. He says, first of all, get your priorities right. He says, Hashem says that Hashem, cares way more about the quality of your actions than the fast days that you keep. God says, what I wanted from you all these years was that you would build a just society. So he says a society, where you take care of the widow and the orphan and the stranger. Basically, a society built around people being kind to each other. Basically, Hashem says, I care more about those things than I do about you fasting. That's interesting. And then Zechariah goes further. He says, one day, these fasts are going to be gone entirely. One day, not only will you not fast on these days, but they'll be transformed into happy days. Okay, but someday, not yet. Right? He's saying someday, but not yet. So when? When will these days be transformed? When will we stop fasting on these days? So Zechariah is not totally clear about that. Because keep in mind, Zechariah lived in a very interesting time. He lived after the Persian king Cyrus allowed the Jews to return to Yerushalayim and to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, so it was an exciting time, but it was also a very difficult one because the Jews who returned struggled greatly, and the project of rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash stalled for a while. So they were in this kind of tweener situation. Yes, the Galut had ended in the sense that Cyrus allowed Jews to return, but the glory days that the returning exiles might have expected actually didn't come so fast. So is this in between where the people, some are returning and it's frustrating and there's disappointment about how the process is going. So Zechariah says, someday the fast commemorating the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, of the first Beit HaMikdash, will be turned into holidays. But we're not there yet. When will we be there? It's not clear. Perhaps when the project of rebuilding the Second Temple actually succeeded. Maybe that's what he meant. Maybe when the project of building the just and peaceful society that God really wanted all the while. Maybe when that succeeds. Maybe that's when these will become happy days. Maybe in Messianic times. He's not clear about when this is supposed to end. At some point, when things are better than today, the fast days, this cycle of fast days will cease to be. Okay, but not yet. And so the cycle of fast that Zechariah talks about has 4 fast days. At this point, if all you had was the book of Zechariah, there's no indication that there's a difference between a major fast and a minor fast. They sound like a group. Cycle of 4 fasts on the same topic, commemorating the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And also they're there, so we commemorate the destruction, and also, Zechariah says, to encourage us to improve our behavior and to build that just society that Hashem actually wants us to build so that we merit a more joyous set of days to come. Okay, that's the book of Zechariah. Now, by the time that we get to the Mishnah and the Gemara, it is clear that there's a major distinction between Tisha B'Av, a major public fast day, and the other 3 minor fast days of that same cycle. So, okay, so let's unpack that. The Gemara discusses this in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. You'll recall that the 3rd Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah says that the Beit Din Hagadol, the Sanhedrin, the Great Court, used to send out, which was situated in the Beit HaMikdash, right? The Great Sanhedrin, back in the day, used to send out messengers to the diaspora at the beginning, it says, of 6 months of the year, to let them know what day Rosh Chodesh was going to be. And the court only sent runners out for those 6 months. They didn't do it every month. They only sent runners to the diaspora in months that had special occasions in them that people would need to prepare for. So, for example, in Nisan, the court sent messengers so that people would know that Pesach was coming, right? So you'd have to know what day is the first day of the month, so you would know what the 15th day of the month, the 14th, 15th day of the month was going to be for Pesach. And in Adar, similarly, they sent out messengers for Purim. And in Kislev, they sent out messengers for Hanukkah. And the Mishnah says in each of those months, something important is coming. You have to know what day of the month you're in, and so we send messengers. Now, the Mishnah says that in the month of Av, messengers were sent out so that people would know when Tisha B'Av would fall. But it's interesting, in the Mishnah's list of months that get messengers and the ones that don't, Tammuz and Tevet, these months that have minor fasts, those months are left out. So in those months, the court did not send out runners, messengers to tell the people what day the month started. So the Gemara, that's the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah says 6 months, messengers. The other months, not. The ones that don't have messengers include months that have minor fasts. So that's where the Gemara kicks in. The Gemara asks, why not? Why did the court not send runners out in those months that had minor fasts? And so the Gemara's answer is, first it says, Shani Tisha B'Av, Ho'el ve'huchpelu bo tsarat. Tisha B'Av is different because on Tisha B'Av there were multiple tragedies. Okay, basically the Mishnah the Gemara there rather is thinking about what the Mishnah in Tanit says. The Mishnah in Tanit in the 4th chapter talks about how Tisha B'Av is this day that doesn't just commemorate one sad occasion, it commemorates a series of sad occasions. And it lists them. It says that's the day that the generation of the desert were sentenced not to enter Eretz Yisrael. And that's the day that the 2 Batei Mikdash were destroyed. But it was also the day that the Bar Kokhba revolt in kind of its end at Beitar, right, its final stronghold, that was destroyed similarly on Tisha B'Av. And also it was the day that the Romans plowed over the city of Jerusalem. So all of these many, many tragedies happened on Tisha B'Av. Okay, that's what the Mishnah in Tani tells us, that Tisha B'Av goes beyond commemorating just the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash by the Babylonians. Sure, Zechariah mentioned it as one of 4 fasts that had to do with that, but the Mishnah explains that Tisha B'Av is about more than that. Tisha B'Av is kind of like is a catch-all day, you could say, where we recall and mourn for the ongoing and recurring tragic episodes of Jewish history. Okay, so bottom line, Tisha B'Av is not. It's one of the 4 of that cycle, but it's about more than just the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So that now to get back to why the Gemara said that, that's why we send messengers to let people know when Tisha B'Av falls out, even after the Beit HaMikdash has been rebuilt. So even in the times of Beit Sheni, the court would let people know that it's Tisha B'Av because Tisha B'Av commemorates so many tragedies, not just the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, it continued on in full force, let's say, in the times of Beit Sheni. But the Gemara says that when it comes to the other 3 fasts of that 4-cycle series of 4-fast series that Zechariah told us about, when it comes to the other fasts, actually those lost something once the second Beit HaMikdash had been destroyed. And keep in mind that Zechariah himself had said, eventually these fasts will be transformed into days of happiness and joy. So the Gemara says, like, with this idea in mind that they might go away and that they're somehow lesser in some sense than Tisha B'Av, the Gemara asks, when are we going to stop fasting on these days? When will we actually kind of follow what Zechariah said? When will we stop fasting on these days? So, and this is what the Gemara says. It says, Amar of Papa, halachic Amar. This is the explanation. Bizman sheyesh shalom, in a time of peace, then yiyu lesason v'simcha. When it's at a time of peace, then, as Zechariah said, these days will become happy and joyous days. But yeshmad, if it's in a time of persecution, so then we continue to fast. And then it says, ein shmad ve'ein shalom, if it is neither a time of peace, but it is also not so bad to be called a time of persecution, then ratzu mitanin, those who wish, fast. And then ratzu emitanin, and those who choose otherwise will not fast. Okay, very interesting. Rav Papa says that what the prophet Zechariah was saying was that in a time in the future of shalom, in a time of true peace, these days will become days of joy and gladness. However, when it's a time of shmad, of persecution, they remain fast days. What about the time in the middle, when it's neither peaceful nor full-on persecution? When it's in the middle, then it's in the middle. Those who want to fast, ratzu, Those who want, not clear if it means individuals or communities, but like, anyways, some people will fast and some people will not. Okay, meaning that, um, interestingly, during Second Temple times, it seems, according to the Gemara's explanation of why runners were not sent out on the months of the minor fasts. In Second Temple times, the Gemara assumes not all communities kept the other three minor fasts every year. That's why you didn't send runners every year, like for example at Tevet and Tammuz, because those fasts were not mandatory at that time. Okay, and Rashi kind of explains a little more clearly that something fundamental had changed between the time of Zechariah and the time of the kind of the heyday of the Second Temple that the Mishnah is thinking of, where you have the Sanhedrin sitting in the fully built out Beit HaMikdash. Okay, the Mishnah is talking about a time during the period of the Second Temple of Beit Sheni when the Beit HaMikdash itself was standing and the Beit Din Hagadol was there, was operating. And at that time, you could legitimately ask the question that delegation had asked Zechariah, which was, why do we still need a fast every year to mourn the last temple when this temple is currently standing? It is kind of an interesting thought. Like, can you imagine in the time of Beit Sheni, someone going to the Beit HaMikdash to commemorate the fast day of the siege of the last temple? Anyways, it's an unusual thought. But anyways, basically the Gemara's answer is that during the period of Beit Sheni, once things were really up and running, the answer to the question, do we need a fast on these days, was, it depends. In that period, it depended on what was going on. Okay, so if it was a time when things were really bad, then yes, those days were they were still sitting there. They were still understood to be distinctive days. They were set aside as potential fast days, and they would kick in. If times are bad and at times of shemad, a time of persecution, people would say, yes, we need to fast on those days and difficult times. For the same reasons, right? To spur us to tshuva, to remind us of how bad things can get, etc. But during that period when the Second Temple was standing, not every community commemorated the minor fast every year. It might be something in between, not quite shalom, not quite shmad, something in between. And in that case, community by community, let's say, they might have treated these days differently. Different communities, different times. Okay. Now Rashi's pointing out this is not the case today. So that whole statement of Arav Papa, like it depends, where Rashi points out, is not the case today. Today, we're in a different situation. We don't have the Beit HaMikdash standing. So once again, we kind of fall into the bad times, he would say. And we fast on these every year. And Rambam, interestingly, when he kind of codifies the laws of fasts in Mishnah Torah, he says something a little bit similar. He says, I'll read it. It says, Kol hatzamot ha'elu, all of these fasts, atidim lebatel, limot hamashiach. They will one day become nullified in the days of Mashiach. And not only that, but they will become days of Sason V'Simcha. So Rambam and Rashi both assume that the fast days have become obligatory once again in our day. They might not have been in the times of the Second Temple. That might have been, it depends. But in our day, they become obligatory once again, and they will continue to be until the third Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt. Okay. Now, interestingly, not everyone agrees with that exact formulation. So if you looked at the Rashba, for example, okay, he has a more modest test of what shalom means for the purposes of when these fast days will become happy. He says, here's his line. He says, Perush, the explanation is, of shalom, bisman sheyesh shalom, when it's peace, when it's a time of peace, sheYisrael shruyim al admatan, at a time when Klal Yisrael, when the people of Israel are living on the land of Israel. Because of course, in his time, that was not the case. So in his formulation, that might be enough for this, for the transformation of the days from fast to celebration. But anyways, let's just say that the majority opinion, as exemplified by Rashi and Rambam, was that something more had to happen. You had to actually have a rebuilding of the third Beit HaMikdash, perhaps the coming of Mashiach. Something had to get much, much better before we would nullify the fasts or even make them it depends category once again. Okay, so we've done a bunch of stuff. Let me just recap so that at this point it's clear. Okay, it seems that the practice of keeping the minor fasts has gone through multiple phases. So let's go through them. During the period of the Babylonian exile, the cycle of 4 fasts, Tisha B'Av and the other 3 together, the 4 fasts that Zechariah mentioned, it seems that they emerged as a way of commemorating the tragedy that had recently befallen our people, which was the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the first one, and our exile, the Babylonian exile. Okay? That's their origin. Now, when the exiles returned to start rebuilding the second Beit HaMikdash, then that's when Zechariah told them, look, guys, it's too early to stop fasting on these days. Things are kind of in flux right now. Because remember, at that point, they hadn't even rebuilt the second Beit HaMikdash yet. At that time, the Jews who returned were struggling awfully in the land. It was a very difficult time for them. Zechariah told the people, don't give up on the fast days quite yet. But I'll give you hope. Someday, in better times to come, we will stop recalling the tragedies of the first Beit HaMikdash. Some days, these fast days will actually become, will rather become days of joy. In the meantime, he says, importantly, in the meantime, focus on the things that you can control and that really matter to God, which is be kind and build the right kind of just society. Okay, so that was the Zechariah period. Now you get to a kind of a third period. Later, during kind of core Second Temple time, when the second Beit HaMikdash was really standing, the Gemara seems to imply that the minor fast took on a more contingent character. When times were bad, then we leaned into the minor fast days once again. They basically became mandatory in times of persecution. But when times were at least decent, not quite shalom, not quite shmad, when they were decent in the middle, minor fasts were essentially voluntary. Then, after the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, now we reach another phase. Things changed again. It became clear that we're back in the bad times. Okay? So now, in this period that we live in the post-Second Temple period, how should we think of it? So Tisha B'Av, the Gemara says, is in a category of its own. Tisha B'Av is about much more than the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. It's about much more than even the destruction of both Beit HaMikdash. Tisha B'Av is the day on which we commemorate and we meditate on the persistent and recurrent tragedies of Jewish history. Of the 4 fasts in the cycle, only Tisha B'Av remained as a true Tanit Tzibur, a real public fast with all of its practices of the 5 afflictions, right? The five Inuyim, starting the night before, not just the morning of. Only Tisha B'Av was kind of like full force, a mandatory public Tanit Tzibur, incumbent on everyone. And interestingly, there is a quote in the Gemara in Tanit from Shmuel who says, Amar Shmuel, Ein Tanit Tzibur beBavel, ela Tisha B'Av bilvad. In Bavel, there's only one public fast day, and that is Tisha B'Av. Okay? So Tisha B'Av, as we said, it's its own thing. It keeps going through destruction, rebuilding, destruction, as strong as it ever was, sadly. Okay? Sadly. Unfortunately, we have enough to commemorate on that day. But the minor fast, the other three fasts, they, as we saw, they were commemorated, then eventually they became voluntary. Then after the destruction, they came back once again. They were taken on once again. But when they were taken on in the post-Second Temple period, they were taken on with a lower level of obligation and with a lower level of stringency. Okay, so they came back, but they didn't come back quite as major, you could say, as Tisha B'Av. They came back minor. So what is that status? What is that status? What makes them, what does it mean that they became mandatory once again, but in a minor way? Okay, so we'll go through some formulations of that, because this starts to emerge. We started with Zechariah in Tanakh, then we talked about the Mishnah and the Gemara. Now we get to the period of the Rishonim, and we start to really see the differentiation of the details of the differentiation, or maybe even an explanation of what a minor fast is versus a major fast. So here's how the Tur formulates it. Because the Tur says as follows. He says, Ve'ayidna, and now, Deleka shalom ve'leka shmad. Now that we're living in times that are neither peace nor persecution. Ratsu mitanin, ratsu e mitanin. We are actually living in a time where, in theory, at least, in they are voluntary. Okay, they are not in and of themselves mandatory anymore. The perush, the leka shalom, and he just says, and kind of parenthetical. Let me explain. It is not a period of shalom, shehabayit charav, because the Beit HaMikdash has been destroyed. So we know we're not living in a time of shalom, of peace. But he says, Veleka shmad b'makom yadu b'Yisrael. But it's not shmad these days either. So he says, Ratzu rov Yisrael v'hiskimu alehem shelo lahitanot. He says that the majority, if the majority of Klal Yisrael, so he's saying not the majority of like, it's not by community, certainly not by individual, but according to him, if all of Klal Yisrael were to agree not to fast, then we would not fast. He says if we agreed to fast, then we would fast. And now here's kind of the punchline. And now, Ratsu v'nahagu litanot. He says, as it turned out, in our days, we have, in fact, taken on the custom to fast on these days. Lefichach, therefore, asur lifrotz geder. You are not allowed to break the fence, not allowed to breach the fence. That's a way of saying that you can't kind of like breach the communal standard. So he's basically saying it's not that these minor fasts are in and of themselves mandatory, but it has become the common practice to treat them as mandatory, and therefore they are mandatory. And if you, as a one-off person, decide to just say, you know what, that's not for me, then you are a fence breacher. You're basically someone who is not following the communal standard, and anyways, you need to. And then he says, interestingly, v'chol sheken, and certainly bedoratenu, in our generation, says the Tur, meaning, it's just, he doesn't explain, but meaning that it obviously was a tough enough time that he's saying, look, things are tough enough right now that you really should be fasting on these days. So then Hilkach, therefore, hakol chayavin litanot, midivrei Kabbalah, mitakanat nevim. Therefore, we are all required to fast on these minor fast days based on a kind of accepted practice dating all the way back to the time of the Nevi'im, as we learned. Okay, that was the Tur. The Ritva puts it a little different formulation. Interesting, he says, this is his comment, he says, Shekvar atzu kol Yisrael v'kiblum alehem ketanit yachidim. That means that all of Israel accepted the minor fasts upon themselves, ketanit yachidim, like personal fasts. We all accepted them as if they were personal fasts, meaning that the common practice is that we all take it upon ourselves. We all voluntarily accept these fasts upon ourselves, but we all do. But they're voluntary, and that's what makes them, and that's the reason why the minor fasts look like voluntary fast days, right? Voluntary fast days, you don't start the night before. Voluntary fast days, you don't do 5 Inuyim. We treat them like personal voluntary fast days, and that's why they are treated differently than the major fast day of Tisha B'Av, which is truly mandatory on the entire Tzibur, on the entire community. Okay, because they're essentially voluntary, right? We all agreed to volunteer to take on these fasts. Okay, so then kind of going through time, we'll do one more. So eventually you get to the Shulchan Aruch. Here's how the Shulchan Aruch codifies it. He says, the 4 fasts are mandatory. So Zakol chayavim litanot arbat somot halalu v'asur lifrotz geder. Okay, everyone has to fast these four fast days, and don't breach the fence. Same language. And then he goes on in the next siman to basically go through how Tisha B'Av is different. Tisha B'Av, we can't anoint ourselves, wash, wear shoes, etc. The 5 Inuyim, and we stop the night before, as opposed to the other 3 fasts, which he says are mandatory. Don't breach the fence. They're mandatory, but they don't have the same level of practice. You don't have the 5 Inuyim. You don't start the night before. Okay, so basically, by the time you get to the period, through the period of the Rishonim, the Shulchan Aruch, by then it's clear that there's a hierarchy within the cycle of fasts. Tisha B'Av, its status never changed. It's in a class of its own, a true Tanit Tzibur, with all of its related rules. The other three fasts of the cycle, they are taken on voluntarily by all of Klal Yisrael, but at a lesser level of stringency. In one formulation, more like a personal fast. We commemorate them more leniently, the way we do a personal fast, etc. Okay, so now at this point, what we've seen is the big distinction: major fast versus minor fast. It is worth mentioning that there is a current among certain poskim to try to narrow the difference between the two, right? So we saw that all the way back in Zechariah there were four, and then we saw that there was this big break between Tisha B'av on the one hand and the other three on the other hand. It should be said that there is a voice or a series of voices in our tradition that tries to narrow the difference between the two. And the strongest of those comes from the Ramban. So the Ramban's view is that fundamentally these four fasts remain a set. They've always been a set and they continue to be a set. He says that they really should have their own rule. They should all have the same rules, right? So according to Ramban, ideally, actually, all four fasts should still be started the night before, and we still shouldn't be wearing leather shoes and all the other hardships that we take upon ourselves. Okay? He says that never really changed, at least lechatchila, at least ideally. And the Mishnah Brura, interestingly, okay, so now getting closer to our time, the Mishnah Brura actually reflects this, or at least a sensitivity to this. He says as follows. He says the reason why the three minor fasts are not treated as stringently as Tisha B'av, he says, basically, she'ein rovat tzibur yacholim la'amod ba, because most people would not be able to handle that. Most people would not be able to handle four Tisha B'avs a year, four Tisha B'av level fasts a year. So the community never accepted that level of stringency. Okay, but he says, the Mishnah Berurah says, uval nefesh yachmir bechulan kemo betisha b'av. He says that a soulful, let's say a pious person, should actually be stringent on all four of these, as stringent as on Tisha B'av. Okay, so he's not quite the same as the Ramban. The Ramban said that truly they remain on the same level. Mishnah Berurah maybe not quite as far, but he goes pretty far. He basically says, okay, for regular people, we have a major fast and three minor ones, but for a pious person, you should really treat them all the same. And this current kind of has a series of followers in different poskim, the Vilna Gaon, the Shla, etc. Okay, so he's not alone, obviously. But this is not a majority opinion, but it's definitely a voice. Okay, so but it is to say, I should say that for everyone except the Ramban, they do agree that strictly speaking, like Meikar Din, strictly speaking, you don't need to treat the three minor fasts as stringently as Tisha B'av. But anyways, there is this debate about like how similar or how different should they be. And even among those who say that the minor fasts are not to be treated like the major fast, there's still like some little exceptions. So for example, a custom emerged not to take a hot bath on the minor fasts. So we don't have to practice the five hardships, the five inuyim, right? Bathing is, right? So we don't have the full thing, but a hot bath, that's going too far. That feels like too lax to do on even a minor fast day. So anyways, you have this kind of interesting sense of like, how different are they? How similar are they in practice, in theory, Meikar Adin, maybe for a pious person, okay? So that's on the one hand. On the one hand, there is this, at least theoretical argument that they should be more, the minor fast should be more strict than they are today. On the other hand, the other thing that we see over and over in the sources is that while in theory you can make a case that the minor fast should be stricter, in practice, there's clearly a history of greater laxity among many Jews in the way that they actually commemorated these minor fasts. Okay, so we have hints. There are hints that what we know in practice today as well, which is that a lot of people don't follow the minor fast quite that strictly. Okay, so here's one hint that in both the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, they both had the same kind of statement. They said these fasts, even the minor ones, they're mandatory. and don't breach the fence. Vasur lifrotz geder. Why do they have to tell you and don't breach the fence? Presumably because a lot of people were breaching the fence, right? They're telling you don't 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 be tempted not to treat these minor fasts seriously just because they're minor, right? Don't breach the fence. And if you're looking for someone even more explicit about it, the Aruch HaShulchan, right? The Aruch HaShulchan, much later in the 1800s, he just explicitly laments. He says, too many people today are not careful about the minor fasts. So it's an interesting setup because, we saw that there is something fundamentally voluntary about these fasts. That already going back to the Gemara already kind of had that idea that the fasts, at least in good times of the second Beit HaMikdash, that they at some point became fundamentally voluntary. And then we saw that they, while fundamentally voluntary, became practically mandatory because the community accepted them. Okay. But even so, it's clear that throughout time, in practice, many people, while theoretically were meant to voluntarily take it on, not everyone quite did that. Okay. So anyways, that description of the obligation, just kind of makes it less surprising. They're voluntary. They're not, but these days they're not really voluntary. But a lot of people don't follow them quite as closely over time. Okay. Okay. Even though that's not what the letter of law would require. Okay, so again, let's do a big recap because we made another big push. So let's bring it all back. So let's remind ourselves. We started with the Gemara, and we saw that there's a big distinction between Tisha B'Av and the minor fast. Tisha B'Av is on a different level, as we saw. It may have started out as part of a cycle of 4 fasts that commemorated the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, but over time, it took on a much deeper meaning. Tisha B'Av is about commemorating the persistent tragedies, the recurring tragedies of Jewish history throughout Jewish history. And so it remains on the books as strong as ever. From the Gemara's perspective, the other 3 fasts are, at least in theory, dependent on the state of things. In times of persecution, mandatory. In times of shalom, celebration. In the middle, depends. Okay? Then we move to the period of the Rishonim, and we saw that the custom emerged to take on the minor fasts as effectively mandatory, right? The Rishonim try to explain that the common practice basically was that we voluntarily took it upon ourselves as though it was mandatory. And that is to say, maybe that the common practice reflected the reality in this long period of exile, right? The Rishonim are living in the medieval times and even onward, right? We've been living in times where the common practice reflected that people felt we need the minor fast days. We need them to meditate on the troubles of our past and to drive us to be better in the future, hopefully towards better days. So that said, when we voluntarily accepted these days as mandatory upon ourselves, we accepted them at a lower level of stringency. Not the night before, not with five inuyim, right? No leather shoes, bathing, etc. Maybe a warm bath's going too far, but in general, at a lower level. Sure, some poskim said you should be stricter. In practice, we know that people maybe were laxer than they should have been. But anyways, that's a push-pull. But you might say that even for the people in the camp who were laxer than they kind of ought to have been, let's say, according to the letter of the law, even for the people who might not follow the letter of the law and keep the minor fasts every year, it's still worth it to think in the Gemara's way of explaining that even for the people who weren't keeping those fast days every year strictly, at least in times of persecution, they should lean into the fast days, right? At least in times of shmad, at least when times are bad, make an extra effort because those are the times when you really need the fast day, right? So yeah, technically they're mandatory every year. But even for the people who are maybe a little lax and didn't keep them every year, at least some years, be mindful that you really need to take the fast days, even the minor fast days, seriously as days of tshuva and of memory in those years. Okay. So I think what all this gets at just to kind of just sum it up and end with this, is that what we see in the minor fasts is kind of a history of the rough road of the exile, right? We see a history of it. That's the first exile is where these fasts come from in the first place. And the practice of the minor fasts gives us a sense of the history of exile since, right? Since the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, which is to say that they kind of capture this idea that there's a range of better and worse, okay? Maybe sometimes it's true persecution. Maybe sometimes it's not full persecution. But through the whole period, you'd have to say it has not been like a pleasure cruise. The whole period of exile has been a tough period. And that's why it seems the common practice became to take on these fasts voluntarily as mandatory, as if people just kind of understood this. There was a common understanding in the Jewish community that while we are in Galut, we need these fast days. If so, then the question becomes, is today any different? In this interesting time where we now have had some return to the land, it's reminiscent in some ways to the period of the returning exiles in the days of Zechariah, where people might ask again, how should we relate to the fast days that remember the last destruction when we're trying to be in the process of rebuilding? Okay, it forces us to think about how to categorize the period that we're living in right now. What is it? Is it shalom? Well, it doesn't feel like shalom. Is it shmad? Is it full-on persecution? I don't know. Is it something in between? What is it? Okay, and if so, what should we do about it? And so it seems that the consensus of the poskim is to give us the same answer today that Zechariah gave in his time, which is to say, someday these fasts will go away again. Someday they'll be converted to days of joy and gladness, okay? But not yet, because we're early in the process. We're in some kind of early in-between period right now. We're like in the days of Zechariah. We're kind of on the way back, but we're not back quite yet. And because we're early in the process, again, kind of channeling what Zechariah said, for now, let's focus on the things that Hashem really cares about. Let's focus on being kind to the widow and the orphan and the stranger. Let's build the society that Hashem wanted us to build the whole time, right? That he cared more about that than the fast days. And while we're working on that, then let's continue to take those fast days seriously because we're not there yet, okay? But hopefully we're on the path. So in our days, as in Zechariah's days, the minor fasts are with us, at least for now. Okay, I'll leave off with that.